All right, we can get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today for MAPS as a platform for equity-based planning. I just want to let you all know that closed caption is available. And if you haven't already popped your name in the chat and where you're from, please let us know where you're coming from today. And I'm Jaleesa Gilmore. I'm the Senior Manager of Environmental Justice Programs at GROUNDWORK USA. So what will we cover today in this webinar? I'll give a quick overview of GROUNDWORK USA, a little bit about our Equitable Land Revitalization Technical Assistance Program, which is how we were able to have this webinar today, a little bit about the power of MAPS for furthering environmental justice, and then we'll hear from our speakers, Lawrence Hoffman and Melissa Guevara from GROUNDWORK Richmond, and then we'll end with a 10-minute Q&A and also share some resources for you all. So what is GROUNDWORK USA? So GROUNDWORK USA is a national environmental nonprofit that's the national support organization for 20 plus people-centered community organizations from New York to Kansas to California. And so GROUNDWORK trusts around the country work to address the history of environmental injustices while transforming urban neighborhoods. And so the network's mission is to create communities that are healthy, green, and resilient. And we do that through 4 major program areas. So transforming neglected land and waterways, increasing resilience to climate and environmental crises, increasing access to healthy food, and also cultivating the next generation of environmental leaders. As part of that work, we're funded by the EPA to offer free technical assistance for communities who have brownfields in them and are looking to make sure that they're incorporating equitable development and environmental justice to their brownfield planning. And so we do that through 3 ways. So we provide free workshops and trainings to help build the capacity for people who want to implement these environmental justice and equitable development strategies into their brownfield projects. We also offer direct technical assistance. So this is free one-on-one customized strategy, tools, peer support, again, for communities who want a more inclusive brownfield planning agenda. And then we also have a visual resource library where we have tools, one-pagers, podcasts, graphic novels, and this is all in an effort to support your brownfields efforts. And so what's the connection between brownfields and environmental justice? So there's estimated that there are more than 450,000 brownfields throughout the US. And these are predominantly located in communities of color, low-income populations. And so according to the EPA, about most of these populations that are in 0.5 miles of a brownfield are these populations. So it's super important for the communities that we're working with in groundwork, but also environmental justice communities throughout the network. And so with that, historic disinvestment, pollution, other environmental justice issues have led to these brownfields being into these communities. And brownfields are really a way that we can transform these neglected spaces into what the community needs in terms of health benefits, social benefits, and also economic benefits. And this is, just so you know, this is a picture of a before and after from our trust in GROUNDWORK Lawrence for a park that they transformed into a brownfield. And so why an important piece of getting those benefits to the community, again, those health benefits, not having environmental contamination in your communities, those social benefits or economic benefits, is really taking the time to work with communities and making sure they're in the driver's seat. And MAPS, we found that visual resources such as MAPS can be a valuable tool to have conversations with communities around their needs and desires and how they want to see their community transformed. And so today we'll focus on sharing how we've done this through our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership. It's a community-based approach for addressing climate needs of urban communities that are disproportionately impacted by extreme heat and flooding due to the legacy of race-based discrimination. It's a capacity building and systems change program where Groundwork Trusts work with residents in 16 cities to really self-advocate for change in their communities to make them more climate resilient. And so although this program isn't specifically limited to brownfields, you'll see in this presentation from Lawrence and Melissa that the principles of equitable development and environmental justice used for this program are 100% applicable to brownfield land reuse in your community. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Lawrence Hoffman.
Great, thanks, Jaleesa. I'm Lawrence Hoffman, Senior Manager of GIS and Data Services at Groundwork USA. My main role here is to do what the title says, provide GIS and data services across the Groundwork network. A huge part of the way that we've done that is through our Climate Safe Neighborhoods program, which Jaleesa just mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. But just to open with, I want to talk a little bit about why we use maps for civic engagement. And there are a number of really important reasons, and these are lessons that we've sort of learned along the way. We sort of started doing this because we thought it might be a good idea and found that it was actually extremely impactful. So first and foremost, it builds awareness of issues. And one of the examples actually from Richmond, and I don't remember exactly who said this to me at one point when we first started Climate Safe Neighborhoods. It might have been Melissa. But the story is that they were going around and showing maps of surface temperature in Richmond, and people that they were canvassing with would say, "Oh, I just thought it was hot in Richmond." They didn't recognize the disparity in temperature between their neighborhood and other neighborhoods in Richmond. So it sort of builds awareness in that way. You can highlight disparities between neighborhoods, and you can start to think about what a different situation would look like. Maps also serve as a neutral entry point to difficult conversations about race specifically. The maps are able to sort of show a very complex and nuanced story at a single glance. And by doing that, you sort of get out of the loop of placing blame right out the gate, and you start to see the situation just as it is. So if you're looking at, for example, a redlining map overlaid with surface temperature, and you can see that redlined areas are to this day much hotter than areas that were not redlined, that's something that at a glance you can digest, and you can start, it becomes sort of self-evident and is difficult to question whether or not it's true. It's accepted easily, and you can move to the conversation about what are we going to do about this. Another important reason that we use maps for this work is because it provides clarity, it anchors arguments, and it legitimizes political demands. So one example I like to use is just a hypothetical example, but if you had a group of residents that knew that it flooded in their neighborhood on a regular basis, if one of those people just goes to a civic forum and says, "Hey, it's flooding in my neighborhood, do something about it," that can just sound sort of like an agitated, angry person complaining. But if residents get together and say, "Hey, does your basement flood when in a heavy rainstorm?" and they start to put points on a map and say, and then show up to that same civic forum together, point to the map and say, "These basements flood when it rains hard." We can look at the map then and start to consider, why does it flood in these areas? You can point to topographical features, you can point to physical infrastructure, and then you can start to make realistic demands about what you want to see changed. Specific investments in infrastructure, whether that's gray or green or whatever it might be. So it takes a real issue and moves it from just a person who is righteously complaining or upset about it, and moving it further towards a solution and a vision for change. You're also speaking the language of city planners when you use maps. So that's another way in which it provides legitimacy to residents. Whether or not residents should need maps to have that legitimate voice is a whole nother conversation, but we've found that it does actually help people be heard when they show up with legitimate concerns. So in terms of climate safe neighborhoods, Julissa touched on it a little bit, but it's a collaboration between Groundwork Trust and 13 different cities. Basically, we're working to support resident-led climate resilience advocacy work. In particular, we use maps to place current disparities in exposure to heat and flooding, which are predicted to increase with climate change. We put exposure to heat and flooding into the context of historical practices of residential segregation. Most commonly, we point to redlining, which is pretty much the most blatant example of state-sanctioned segregationist policy. And I won't get too far into that. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to the Mapping Inequality Project. But basically, the federal government was backing mortgages, and they created maps to determine which neighborhoods were a safe bet for getting their money back on investment. And the criteria for making the maps was largely race-based. So communities of color were blatantly excluded from this investment at a time when housing would have otherwise been affordable to them. And redlining is often pointed to as one of the main codifiers of residential race-based segregation in the United States. So we use these maps to sort of point to the legacy of segregation and its contemporary consequences in terms of climate vulnerability and climate exposure. So we don't stop at making the maps. We then provide the maps to local advocates who facilitate conversations with residents, policymakers, basically around equity and climate resiliency planning and resource distribution. So it's becoming more and more common that cities and other public institutions have funds set aside for climate resilience planning. We want to make sure that people that have in the past been excluded from investment and for that reason are more exposed to the risk of climate change are prioritized in these contemporary climate resilience investments. And like I've already mentioned, we found that when residents show up to civic forums with these maps, it influences the conversation in surprising ways. The analysis that we're running, and some are very often the most simple way that you can use maps. The very important point here is not that we're doing some type of revolutionary analysis. What we're doing is we're putting maps into the hands of the people who can actually do something with them. I forgot these slides were in here. So this is not a map. This is a graph made using geospatial analysis that summarizes surface temperature, impervious surface, and tree canopy cover by HOLC grades. And HOLC grades are basically the redlining grades, the A, B, C, D from the residential securities maps. And this is for Richmond, Virginia. This is the first place where this analysis was done. And so you can see that as you move from A to D, from green to red, surface temperature increases, tree canopy decreases, and impervious surface increases. And you can go to the next slide, please. And this is that same analysis for all of the cities that have so far participated in climate safe neighborhoods. And you can see that you get the same result if you do that for all cities. So this is not a mistake. This is something that was intentional planning. And so we are working with residents to be intentional about mitigating the current consequences of that reality. So these are the map products that we sort of across the board apply or provide for each of our participating trusts. We make a dashboard which contains all manner of different data layers, demographic, EJ screen. The one you're looking at right there is a flood model that we actually collaborated with the new school in New York City to create for Groundwork Milwaukee. And essentially this dashboard is made to give a very broad geographic context of the real world situation in the city so that we can work with our trust to form a strategy around engagement. And then our on the ground advocates can use the dashboard to lead conversations. At least that was the initial intention. The dashboards have sort of taken on a life of their own and have kind of been used more broadly than we anticipated when we first created them. We also create a story map because we found that the dashboard on its own, if you just share that link, people are swimming in data and they don't really know what to do with it. So to sort of address that issue, we, for each of the trusts, created a story map that sort of walks through the CSN strategy and basically uses data to tell the narrative about the neighborhood specifically that we're investing our energy in advocating and organizing with. And that's something that was made with the intention of living a little more passively online that people can come to and understand what we're talking about using the data, but also using historical documents and real life examples of what's happening in the neighborhoods at the moment. And then we also, we haven't done this for all of the trusts, but we have where it's been useful, create old school transparencies. So if you're of a certain age, you may remember that when teachers had to project things onto the wall, they used to use these little clear acetate papers. We've been using those to make map overlays. So basically we take data layers, we print them onto these acetate pages, and then they can overlay them on the base map. And we found that these are really good in community forums because it, for one, it keeps people engaged because they have a physical thing, they get to put their hands on the map. But then they also are in a smaller group, like talking about what they're seeing. And as you can imagine, that's an entirely different experience than if you just have some wonky expert clicking through some slides, right? It's a much more engaging experience. We've also found that it's useful because it's low tech. A lot of community engagement happens in community spaces that have varying degree of connectivity and technology. So not having to rely on that is a relief. And they're mobile. You can go out in the world, you can knock on doors and share the story with people, just pull it out of a bag and there you go. So those are the three main products that we provide, and they've had, you know, they have their different utilities, but we found that they've generally achieved what we were going for. Yeah, so now that we've talked a little bit about what types of map products we've provided, I want to just do a quick overview of some of the sort of success stories that we've had using maps in this realm. And then we'll be lucky enough to speak with Melissa, who has real world experience using maps in community engagement and organizing. So our first example is from Groundwork Denver. They did basically the most simple thing that you can do with a map. They said, hey, this place over here is different than that place over there. They highlighted the residents that we're engaging with in Denver are from Globeville, Elaria, Swansea, also known as GES. And they highlighted that their neighborhood has a significantly lower tree canopy cover than a neighborhood that's basically a half mile away. And they brought that map to city officials who had recently set aside all kinds of money for climate resilience and basically used that to demand trees and were promised trees. Those plans fell through. So then their next step was to use the maps to recruit people to participate in a training program that would essentially get them onto the civic board that decided what to do with climate resilience dollars. So 10 residents were trained, 6 applied to be on the board, 4 were accepted onto this board, and 1 is the co-chair. So as you can imagine, there probably wasn't a proactive effort from the city to recruit people from this neighborhood to be on the climate resilience board. I can't remember what it's called, but whatever the task force is that's deciding what to do with all this money. So the actual civic engagement around canvassing, knocking on doors, and recruiting people to be in this program is a huge part of why that neighborhood, GES, now has a huge voice in what's happening with these climate resilience dollars. We can go to the next one, please, Julissa. Oh, and these are some pictures. So this is the 2 neighborhoods that were compared in the previous slide. This is called Whittier neighborhood. It's probably not pronounced like that. But this is the neighborhood. You can see it's in November, so there's no leaves on the tree, but you can see that there's a preponderance of trees on this street. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see GES, where there are significantly fewer trees. And these are the women who participate in the training. They're referred to as promotoras, and they actually completed the program, and some of them are on the board. One of them is actually the co-chair, and I wish I could say which one in the picture that was, but I honestly haven't learned about that. Okay, so Groundwork Rhode Island is another example. In Groundwork Rhode Island, they had a public fund for planting trees, a certain budget set aside, but the process for which the trees were distributed, which seems sort of fair on its surface, which is first come, first serve, actually ended up in the trees usually ending up in more affluent, whiter neighborhoods because those neighborhoods were more tapped into the fact that they could get these trees. And there's a huge Spanish-speaking population in, we're speaking specifically about Central Falls and Pawtucket, Rhode Island, just to be clear here, that there's a significant Spanish-speaking population in those 2 cities. And the instructions for getting the trees were only in English. So this is just an example of how a public structure or system that seems equal on its surface can be extremely inequitable. So all of these trees most of the trees were going to places that didn't really need the trees or that were already cool. And so Groundwork Rhode Island was able to use the maps to argue that this process was inequitable and that the trees should be distributed on a more need-based process. And now the city uses the heat vulnerability index that we actually created for Groundwork Rhode Island. And they also use environmental justice screen in prioritizing where to place the trees. We can go to the next one, please, Julissa. Groundwork Elizabeth. And this is an incredible story that actually used the maps and the story of redlining to sort of change the worldview, you could say, of certain city officials, that now it basically has normalized the conversation around redlining at the local government level, to the extent that there is now a mayor youth council that has been given unlimited trees. And I'm sure that's sort of, there probably would be a limit if they got too carried away, but basically just saying, engage with residents, speak to the people in your neighborhood, use the maps to identify places that would benefit most from the trees, and then come back to us and we will give you the trees. So there's a huge change there. This also led to incredible collaborations basically along the East Coast, where cities have been adopting similar climate safe neighborhoods type models that involve using maps to highlight inequities in distribution of public resources for climate resilience, and to think more about vulnerability in terms of future distribution of those resources. So those are some of the examples from climate safe neighborhoods in ways that maps have really opened some of the doors, opened some doors for our people on the ground. And you can go to the next slide, please. These are some quotes, just so you know, I'm not tooting my own horn here in terms of the maps, from GROUNDWORK Elizabeth and from GROUNDWORK Hudson Valley. So we can go to the next slide, I think. So you may be asking yourself, you're talking about climate resilience. This is a brownfields webinar, right? So it's true that CSN is focused on climate resilience, but we actually think about it as equity-based brownfields work. We have sort of two core goals in climate safe neighborhoods. One is to change the way that decisions are being made at the local government level about how resources are being distributed. And the second is to be actively and physically engaged in implementing these sort of like 1% solutions towards climate resilience neighborhoods. So that's like tree planting or green infrastructure, whatever it might be. And all of those sort of 1% solutions occur almost always in brownfields or on other unused urban space. So it's sort of smaller scale brownfield work that isn't always thought about in the brownfield sphere. But we think of it as brownfield work, and the sort of strategies that we use in CSN, we're confident would apply to larger brownfields projects. And ways in which it might is framing the importance of the work. So we sometimes talk about urgency of purpose, like why here, why now? Why does this particular site need to be converted from a contaminated site? Why should this one be prioritized? And you can use maps to show that. You can show like land surface temperature to show how hot the site is. You could make a climate resilience effort there. You could use certain types of health data to talk about the health consequences of living next to a brownfield. Really, you could make all kinds of arguments using maps to support the sort of urgency of purpose argument around brownfield redevelopment. You could also use maps to help determine use. So you could show up to community forums and perhaps show like the neighborhood and its access to green space. You could highlight if there exists an inequity for that neighborhood and other neighborhoods in terms of access to green space. You would maybe then argue that this should be a park. And that's just a hypothetical example. But that's how you could use maps in a large brownfield redevelopment project to help determine use. Another concept that you could sort of use or think about with maps is thinking about gentrification. It's always a concern when you're engaged with residents, whether you're redeveloping a site for residential purposes or to be like a new green space. Residents are always concerned about the values of their homes and whether they're going to be displaced once that site is improved or changed. So you could use maps to begin to think about and plan for gentrification that may or may not happen as a result of a brownfield redevelopment. And we've actually developed dashboards with some collaborators doing large brownfield redevelopment projects in Philadelphia and in Flint, Michigan. Yeah, so that's how we've implemented maps in our work. But you know, I'm just like a technical person. All of my knowledge of how useful this is secondhand. So luckily, Melissa is here to tell you a little bit more about what it's really like using maps on the ground to engage with communities for equity-based planning.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. So we'll keep it moving, and these are just some map resources, and we'll keep it moving and pass it to Melissa, and then we'll have time for some Q&A, and feel free to pop some questions in the chat in the meantime. Thanks. Melissa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa. I am part of Groundwork Elizabeth, Youth Program Director there. And I'm here to talk to you guys about a little bit about Groundwork and some of the work we've done. So if we can move on to the next slide. So as Jalisha said, we are part one of the trusts in the Groundwork USA family, really. And that's our mission or vision. You guys can read that. But more importantly, the main thing to take away from this is that we are a youth development organization that works and focuses in on the climate equitable, environmental conservation of world. We even dip a little bit into food access, but the main thing is that we work with youth and try to represent their vision of how the world should be and try to work with them to become changers, like game changers into the future. And so we do this by having our three main programs here. And I would like everyone to guess which one of these programs is the bike program. But it's Green Team, it's the Bellmead Bike Shop, right? And then it's our Green Workforce program, and they each have their own lane. Green Workforce is really about post-high school students who want to learn a little bit more about just work development, get some of those hard skills down, which includes things like learning how to put in impermeable paving, learning how to create rain gardens, doing a lot of the green infrastructure work that we've been talking about, especially when it revolves around climate safe resiliency. And then our Green Team is our high school program, and that is really about teaching our youth to question and empowering them to make changes in their own lives. And the Bellmead Bike Shop is a mixture of elementary, middle school, and sometimes a little bit of high school. And the main thing is about transportation and access to proper forms of secondary transportation. And that means that's kind of how we go into the environmental aspect for that. Just to explain the pictures real quick, the first one for the Green Team is actually them participating at one of our NOAA events. And they were able to participate as completely integrated into this program. One of our partners from the Science Museum of Virginia and Jeremy Hoffman actually came in and taught our youth about what they were going to learn when they were there. And so they'd be active participants instead of almost like in a teacher role, but not quite that. And then our bike shop picture is actually from our Camp Spokes program, which is about empowering them presenting and non-binary youth with the opportunity to become bike mechanics and just learn more about that form of transportation. And our Green Workforce guys are just down at Oakwood Arts Center, beautifying the space because it deserves it. They put in a lot of native plants. We can move on. So we talked about all the great work we do with the Climate Safe Neighborhoods work. And I would just like to tell you guys that part of our work, which ended in 2021 about-ish, was to try to influence our master planning process in Richmond, Virginia. And the great thing about the work we did was, and I guess the great opportunity we had, was that this once in a lifetime moment was happening where we could influence the course of a city for the next decade and a half, right? And with the work of a lot of other partners and with the help of our youth to try to empower, strengthen, and have our local residents in our neighborhoods have the language and ability to talk in these forums that the city was setting up, we were able to accomplish some of our goals, right? And we were able to include the idea that we deserve resiliency in all of our neighborhoods that have been disproportionately affected for a long time. So you can see some of the goals and the objectives that, are binding objectives that were approved by the city and will have real effects And one of the greatest things is that right after RVA Richmond 300, sorry, lots of words. But right after Richmond 300 came about, we had a second processing, which is RVA Green 2050, which is one of the methods that we're going to be implementing a lot of these changes, which include, I didn't include in the pictures because they've been shown, but include increasing canopy in areas that don't have much canopy and assisting to reduce urban heat island effects. One of the big issues in Richmond is in some of the neighborhoods, we do have a lot of flooding. And then right after the flooding, we get a lot of bugs, right? We have mosquito issues, and that translates to health issues for our residents, and all of those concerns were voiced. But when we're talking about all of this, right, it goes beyond just what CSN meant. It went beyond just Richmond 300. It went towards RVA 2050 and all the things that happened right after that. Because our maps were some of the first maps. Jeremy Hoffman also had a pair of maps out, and we really got the word out to a lot of residents and a lot of community members and had them talking about it. Sometimes it was surprising when I would go into meetings thinking that I would be the only person to talk about heat-related issues, health issues that all come out of result from this, and I wasn't. It was some random person from some random neighborhood, and they were talking about it. Sometimes they didn't know or have the maps on them, but they said they would tell their elected officials that everyone should be focusing in to make sure that we were creating a more equitable future together. So we can go on to the next one. And one of the greatest things that happened out of all of this, so this map right here is actually from the city of Richmond. They have made their own climate index map. And it's perfect because it expanded what it meant to be equitable in the city. City officials use this. A lot of nonprofits use this map. And it doesn't just have heat and flooding or all the environmental terms. It also has things like health outlooks. It has schools, it has food access, it talks about crime. And it's one way where we are really putting power and knowledge back into the people, into the neighborhood, to the communities, to the places we work and appreciate. And it helps us refocus how we should plan action and make sure that we are focusing on the communities of need. One such task here was actually the creation of new parks in Richmond, because we had noticed that a lot of times we did not have access. When we mean we don't have access, sometimes we have some of the most beautiful parks, right? We have a huge riverfront park that runs through Richmond, but a lot of the neighbors that we worked with, a lot of the youth we interact with have never been to this park. It's just too far away. What may seem like an easy 20-minute walk for some becomes really difficult if we're talking about lack of walkway access, lack of transportation. I think a 20-minute walk is a really nice number unless you have a toddler at hand, right? Or you're rolling around with a stroller, at which point those 20 minutes can take an hour. And we could skip on to the next one. And it was great, right? In 2020, 2021, we had this amazing opportunity to choose. It was like a roundtable of stakeholders, but this was a request from our mayor, LeVard Stoney, to pick 5 new locations for parks. And this is actually from a press release that the city of Richmond came out with. And it spells it out absolutely correctly, right? It's like, just due to disproportionate impacts, Black and Brown communities have high needs for walkable green spaces. It took into account that there's neighborhoods where households don't have vehicles. These neighborhoods also tend to have really high impacts of climate vulnerability, and that these neighborhoods then don't have parks for folks to enjoy. And it was amazing to hear our mayor say that the benefits of green spaces should be enjoyed by all and should have benefits to all our residents. Once again, I was part of the green team, but I was not the only member there, and I was honored to be part of it. So why do we continue talking about maps, right? We can move on to the next slide. So maps can be this vast conduit of a power. it, in my mind, has become our superpower to have access, especially in Richmond, to maps that can accurately tell a story about how neighborhoods are being disproportionately affected. Because we can talk about anything really. Sorry, can you click the first one? Yeah, so we can talk about how energy burdens are occurring and how areas that have less trees have more impermeable paving, have higher heat. And a lot of times these neighborhoods are also the ones who have limited resources and incomes, are also the ones who are then forced to pay for more electricity in order to cool their homes, and how sometimes they're the ones who are really going to face the brunt of all of this. And then sometimes we can talk about how COVID risks are increased due to disproportionate action, or maybe how our residents are affected by eviction, right? And how this all has happened on purpose pretty much, and how eviction and COVID are correlated. Or sometimes we can talk about food access and how some of our neighbors in some of these areas that are the most afflicted by low health outcomes and eviction rates are also the ones who can't find food, right? They're not food deserts, they're food swamps. They can't have access to healthy foods. Or we can also talk about how a lot of the residents that suffer from all of these issues are also folks of color. I have dogs, sorry. And sometimes, especially for us at Groundwork RVA, the most important part for us here is that a lot of these folks that we are looking into and talking about are, and one last click, these are our youth, right? We are a youth development organization, and we can tell exactly where, I'm so sorry, but we could tell exactly where our youth live and how they are affected by all of these issues. And that's a great tool for us. And a lot of times what we're not talking about and what we don't want to do, especially being part of Groundwork RVA, is that we're a conduit for change. We're not going in and describing to our youth what they should change in their neighborhoods, because our youth have that power already, right? They understand how and why and have ideas of their own of how they can benefit and assist their neighbors. What we need to do is just teach them about all the things that are underlying issues, give them examples about how it can all be explained, assisted, fixed, and allow them to make the decisions. Right? Because we never want to take the agency away from any of these neighborhoods that we're working within. We are not trying to save them. We are just trying to collaborate with them and offer them resources and assistance to make their world a better place. Next slide are just a bunch of links. And I put the whole URLs in there if anyone wants to take a picture of that. But they're just cute little URLs. And then that's kind of it. Thank you guys. I hope I was coherent.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Lawrence. So now we can open it up for some Q&A. I think we have about 12 minutes left, so we'll do 10 minutes for Q&A. You can pop questions in the chat, or you can come off mute, raise your hand, whichever best suits your way that you want to ask questions to our amazing presenters today.
All right, but thanks for taking the time. Definitely helps.
And so actually, I remember that we did have a question in the chat about the maps and whether or not they're available. So if you go to our website, groundworkusa.org, and then you click what we do, climate resilience, you can find all the story maps. So those are the maps that, this is the app that has like pictures of the maps, pictures of the community, and tells the story of climate safe neighborhoods. Currently, not all of the actual dashboards where all the data that Lauren shared are public facing, but I know some Groundwork Trust do have that public facing, like I can say Groundwork NRG in Kansas City, they have their dashboard on their website. So feel free to reach out to the 13 cities, 16 cities in the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership if you're interested and, to see their dashboard. So Lawrence, I have a question for you. I think you started to mention some of the resources for finding data, but we talked a lot about visualizing data, but do you ever have trouble accessing that data? And can you share a little bit about what some resources communities can use to access this data so they can actually visualize maps and do all this great work with the community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you don't have any GIS experience, I think your best bet is probably to rely on some of the publicly available map portals, similar to the one that Melissa was showing, the RVA Green 2050. A lot of these map portals are starting to be more and more common. Your city might have one where you can easily open up a map and then click through certain layers that they have publicly available. That's pretty nifty if you don't have any GIS experience, because what you'll otherwise have to do is download the data and figure out how to put it on a map yourself. But there are a lot of these web portals out there, so check your local government. A lot of the resources that I shared in that slide actually have their own web portals associated with them, where you can choose to map it in your web browser, or you can download and use the actual data yourself. So you can make that choice based on your expertise. But if you have no expertise and you don't have access to someone who does, then using the tools that are already built to just click through different layers is what I would do. And you can make serviceable maps using like screenshots and whatever to make your point that way. But definitely check, like if you're in a city with a university and you would like some GIS or geographic support in your institution, check your local university, because they probably have a geography department and they probably have academics that are interested in what you're working on. So it's definitely worth reaching out. There's a GIS expert somewhere near you who's interested in your project, most likely.
Melissa, did you have anything to add to that before I move on to the next question?
Yeah, no, I'm not a GIS expert.
Okay. So this question I think is for Lawrence. You talked about planning for gentrification and introducing new green spaces. Can you elaborate on that? What does that look like? My understanding is that it would be really important to bring the city on board to invest in affordable housing, rent control, zoning measures, etc. And they're interested in learning more about how that process could look like.
Yeah, gentrification and anti-gentrification specifically is what I would be interested in learning more about. But unfortunately, at the moment, I'm not really an expert in that area. What data sources that probably would be useful are like the types of property resources that are usually available at the public level from local governmental institutions. But I mean, whoever asked the question sort of hit it on the head. That's something like if you're trying to freeze rents, you're trying to get these certain types of anti-gentrification policies in place, you're going to want to be in contact with your city and all these other people who probably have their own ways of thinking about and measuring gentrification. So being a part of that conversation is probably the first step. Yeah, but I don't have any specific methods for doing that off the top of my head.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. And I also just want to mention our partners through the Urban Water Learning Network, River Network. They shared some resources that they've explored this issue through the Urban Waters Learning Network, and it's in the chat. You'll see Renee posted it. So hopefully that's helpful.
Can I actually mention something on this?
Yeah.
I was part of an advisory group that was trying to that was trying to measure gentrification in Richmond. And honestly, it was a can of worms, and we ended up having more questions about how we can assist than we had answers. But one of the greatest things that we were able to do, and once again, it all kind of comes down to whether or not officials want to release data, but we actually created a map, which I'm not sure if it's public yet, but we requested that that map actually show turnover of ownership, because we were trying to see if we could measure the rate at which Richmond and developers were buying up family homes, fixing them up within a year, and then selling them for higher prices, and trying to measure like that increase of like cost. Once again, I think we had more answers. We had more questions and answers at the end of it all, but that was one of the things that we tried to create. And we is the royal we, because I can't GIS map anything. But we had a lot of questions about like how we could measure this to figure out where we could talk about having more concrete anti-gentrification solutions, I guess. But I guess the first thing for me, especially when creating maps, and I've seen it, is that once you have the map, it's kind of like the boogeyman's out of the closet. You can't really stick the thing, like it's like the can of worms. It's like the peanut can of worms. Like once it's out, you can't. It's hard to put that information back in. So once that information goes out, it's going to be hard to not focus in on gentrification anymore. Yeah, power is knowledge, or knowledge is power, both ways.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Melissa. So there's another question about, does Groundwork have experience with the knowledge/technology transfer to communities, or is the majority of the experience from a hired consulting perspective? Are community members themselves taught how to use the software to make their own maps, or open source software options used are predominantly Esri? So I can start off with this question, and then I'll hand it over to Lawrence or Melissa to kind of elaborate more. So through the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, the 16 cities based in Groundwork Trust neighborhoods, Groundwork USA, aka Lawrence Hoffman, creates the actual dashboards and the maps and collects the data. But then through our partnership and working with all the CSN coordinators, but of course they have different titles, youth director and their trust, we train them on how to use the dashboards, understand the data, how to use it with the community. And some people and other trusts do have their own GIS experts, but then we also teach the community how to use these dashboards. I don't think we've shown them how to create maps, but I could be wrong. Maybe some cities have done that, but I'll give that overview and I'll let Lawrence or Melissa share any more.
Yeah, I think you pretty well framed it up there, Julie. So we haven't done a ton of training residents to actually make their own maps, but the maps that we do make, we sort of consider them like a constant conversation with our organizers, and by proxy with the residents that they're organizing with. So if a group of residents identifies that they're worried about energy burden, then we find energy burden data and we put it on the map so they can bring it to the next meeting. So it's sort of starts as like and across the board, like we make the same thing for everybody. And then that kicks off a conversation that evolves once residents are involved in the conversation. We get to learn about what they care about, what issues most concern them, and what tools might help them vision like different uses of space in their neighborhoods.
For us, same thing. In the past, we've taught our youth how to interpret dashboards, but into the future, we were having this conversation about potentially having some of our youth learn how to make maps, especially when it revolves around food access, where they would literally go around and GPS tag every food place that they found, and then somehow give it a qualification of it being fast food, if it having fresh food, and then potentially having someone at the Science Museum of Virginia assist us with like teaching them how to map it, even if it's not their final product that we use. But the idea is that they would learn how to do the rudimentary basics. But I'm sure as anybody who's learned or tried to learn how to use ArcGIS, it's a really complicated system and it takes weeks and weeks. Usually you take a course or like 12 courses to like learn how to use all the little aspects of it. So even if we did teach them, it would just be like a toe dip rather than anything else. But we thought that it'd be a good thing in case some of our youth are thinking of going to college or making this a possible career pathway.
Yeah, that's a good point, Melissa, where I have done some youth trainings in the past. But because of the structure of the program, it's difficult to get too in depth. So it's really more of like, hey, look what you can do with maps. Here's like an introductory thing that you can make. Keep in mind that this is a career because most people don't think of it as one, and that I'm a resource if you want to go further. So in terms of that, like real training, that's something that we haven't extended to at this point.
Thank you so much, Lawrence and Melissa. It is 2:00. I saw there were some more questions in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me, Lawrence, or Melissa to continue the conversation. Also, just want to highlight that we do provide free technical assistance around brownfield, but other land reuse opportunities as well at that link here. And to keep up to date on any like brownfield stuff that's happening and groundwork in the Groundwork Network, subscribe to our newsletter. It's all the way at the bottom of our website, and you can click on equitable development tools and resources. And we'll also share the recording to this webinar after this. Yeah. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Lawrence and Melissa. Again, thank you to the EPA for providing support for this webinar. I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.